I'm Finn Harper. I'm the director of Open City, which is a think tank based in London. We run Open House, but I also curated the 2019 Oslo Architecture Triennale with...
Hi, I'm Maria Smith. I'm an architect and engineer based in London, and I was one of the chief curators of the Oslo Architecture Triennale 2019. For a long time, governments have included economic growth as one of the key policies for sort of measuring the success of their terms and for society as a whole. But the problem is that if you look at economic growth against resource extraction of materials, against carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions, for every increase, every bump in GDP, you also get an increase in those sort of environmental indicators. And we can see quite clearly that the more we pursue economic growth, the more that we are causing damage to the environment and causing a climate crisis. And so while lots of sort of governments are still trying to find ways in order to sort of grow our way out of this problem.
I guess there's two problems. One is that infinite growth is probably just impossible, right? And I've brought a balloon to illustrate that point very simply. Now this is like, you know, little planet Earth. It's producing a certain amount of oxygen mix. There's a certain amount of economic activity happening. If I try to double the amount of economic activity that's happening, it gets quite a lot bigger. We've still got some give to go though. We can still probably get a bit more growth out of this. So let's try doubling it again. Now I can start to feel there's a tension emerging, right? As I've tried to grow my economy more, I'm reaching some sort of limit, but there's still a little bit. Can we double again? Now I'm not going to keep going because you can probably tell that we're reaching a breaking point, right? We've tried to grow beyond, we grow to the limit of what this planet can sustain. And if we go any further, the whole thing is going to break and collapse. But the other problem, right, the sort of part of growth is that it's not doing what we think it's doing. You know, economists tell us that growth is good because it's good for everybody, right? Poor people benefit from economic growth, rich people benefit from economic growth. Everybody wins. But in fact, this is sort of not true. It turns out if you look at who has benefited from economic growth in the 20th and 21st century, it's not everybody. It's a very small proportion of society. So the idea that we need to keep growing the economy is like impossible in the long term, but in the short term is also bad for people who don't have wealth and resources already.
Yeah, I mean, I think...
Degrowth.
I think we have to look at what the economy is for. Is the economy supposed to be for the accumulation of wealth in a very small elite section of society? Well, some people might quite like that, but I think most of us would probably agree that that is not the goal. And the problem at the moment is with this incentivizing of overall economic growth and the way that our economies are set up is that that's what's happening. The more growth we're seeing, the more inequality that we're seeing. And what we need is to build an economic system that isn't based about sort of accumulation of wealth, but is based around the sort of just distribution of resources and wealth and security for everyone.
So you can have lots of different kinds of economy, right? You could have a feminist economy where you're prioritizing the types of labor or activity which have been traditionally devalued by the power of the patriarchy. Or you could have an ecological economy where you're valuing things that are good for the planet and good for plant life rather than things that maximize economic value. The problem is that we've sort of forgotten that economics is a social science where you have lots of different options and different kinds of economy. And we've focused on this one particular idea of what economics should be, which is all about growing the economy. And can you see if I juggle in this? So like I use juggling because you can have a small economy, that would be fine. You could have a big economy, that would be fine. You could have a very complicated economy that's doing lots of things. The problem is that we're obsessed with one economic strategy, which is growing and 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 growing until you reach the limits of that economy and the whole thing collapses because it can't grow anymore. So it's not that we should forget about economics. Economics is fantastic and brilliant, and we should, in a sense, we should all become economists. We should use the power of thinking about how materials and energy move around a society through trade and exchange, which is what economics is, but we should do that in order to improve everybody's lives and to improve the conditions of the planet, rather than to do this very particular thing of just growing GDP, growing the economy, growing gross domestic product.
I think some of us sort of working in architecture like to think that we are artists, we're part of a creative industry, that, you know, we get into architecture thinking that, you know, we care about society and we care about the arts and things like that. But then we sort of get into practice and we're part of the property industry, we're part of this kind of big kind of financial market that is sort of creating value through creating kind of huge skyscrapers and trading real estate and all of this kind of stuff. And part of the thesis is that we need to understand that we as architects and engineers are complicit in this growth project, that whenever we build a building because somebody's going to sort of be able to then trade that and make more money from it and we're part of that process. And so we're not sort of innocent of that. And so we have to sort of look at our own industry as well and look at the ways in which we're taking part in the growth project. But also that architects, because we went into university, probably, you know, most of us, because we like the arts and we care about society and so on, we're in a good position perhaps to be thinking about imagining alternatives. You know, as Finn was saying, that we can have any kind of economy that we want. This is ultimately a design problem. Architects love design problems. We're sort of propositional by nature. So I think architects as a group and as an industry can also sort of think about what are the alternatives that we could have. So, for example, one of the things is around sharing. At the moment, the way that sort of the growth economy and capitalism and consumerism sort of drives us towards each having our own everything. We have our own cars and our own washing machines, and obviously that's very, very resource intensive. And we all have our own houses that have our own kind of, you know, four walls, and this is what the economy ideally wants us all to have. But if we created a kind of architecture and urbanism that was based around sharing scarce resources, but understands that we don't have so many resources for everybody to have, you know, we would need, 3.5 planets for everybody to live like, you know, some of the wealthiest people on this planet. And so that automatically creates a different kind of urbanism and a different kind of architecture that we can illustrate and we can propose and we can design in order to help sort of design us out of this crisis.
For example, at the moment, contemporary architecture tends to specify a lot of very high carbon materials like steel and concrete. Steel and concrete in particular is not, you know, it's not that amazing a material. It comes as a liquid, it takes a long time to harden, it takes an extraordinary amount of energy to make it, you need special trucks to transport it around. It's not like the best material in the world in kind of its performance. It's quite weak in compressive strength. What's good about concrete is that there are so many different processes that go into making it that there's lots of opportunities for economic growth to happen, for a little bit of trade to happen at every stage of how you make a concrete building. And so maybe if we were thinking about unraveling the logic of economic growth, we could start to say, okay, well, maybe this kind of highly complex material like concrete isn't such a good thing. Maybe we should start to build more ambitiously with simpler materials like stone or wood, which don't require this kind of elaborate, energy-intensive process to get them to site and get them into a structure.
Anything that grows sequesters carbon while it's growing, so then it locks that carbon into its sort of self, and then if you can then use that and store that in a building, then that means that you've kept that carbon from being emitted into the atmosphere. So anything like timber, bamboo, straw, anything that grows like that is really good for sequestering carbon. But other low carbon materials are things like sort of earth and hempcrete and sort of unfired compressed earth blocks and things like that. So they're very low carbon, but they demand a different kind of architecture. You can't sort of design a modernist masterpiece and then think about, okay, what am I going to make this out of in order to make sure that it's a low carbon building? You have to start thinking differently right from the very beginning when you're starting to design that building, to start thinking about low carbon materials that inherently create a different kind of aesthetic that we sort of haven't become used to over the last 100 years. The kind of aesthetic that we've learned to sort of lust after is much more inherently high carbon. So we have to sort of dream a new kind of architecture now that is much more kind to the planet.
What is exciting about degrowth is that we've been doing it for thousands of years, right? There are examples of degrowth everywhere you look. Every time you share something with a neighbor or a friend, you have exchanged without going through economic trade, you know, and in a way that's bad for the economy, right? Every time you borrow a book from a library, you have damaged the economy in a small way because you didn't buy that book, you didn't pay anybody any money for that book. Hanging out with your children, having sex with your partner, going on a long walk through the countryside, these are useless in economic terms, but they're really good for, you know, a happy life that keeps people well and active and, you know, in touch with their sort of their spiritual side or their social side or their cultural side.
I think that we can live a really rich and wonderful life under a kind of an economic system that isn't sort of driving us mad in order to be more and more and more and more and more and more productive, and that actually we could all be much happier.